Welcome, everyone. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you joining us online and those of you in person to Here Right Matters, a conversation with Alexander Vindman. You may know Vindman from Vindman, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, from his decision to report an infamous phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019, a decision which thrust Vindman into the national spotlight and led to President Trump's impeachment. But before he was a public figure, Vindman was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant growing up in Brooklyn's Brighton Beach neighborhood. He's here today at the Museum of Jewish Heritage because he has a story to tell about the Soviet Jewish immigrant experience and about the ways that experiencing antisemitism and authoritarianism can inspire a career in public service. Vindman explores both his background and the decision that ignited a political firestorm in his new memoir, Here Right Matters, An American Story. Those of you with us in person can purchase the book after today's program in the museum lobby, as well as get it signed by the author. Those of you joining us online can order a copy of Here Right Matters at the link in the live stream chat. We're honored to have CNN Senior Global Affairs Analyst Biana Golodryga with us to interview Vindman today. In addition to being a distinguished journalist at CNN and the former co-anchor of CBS This Morning, Golodryga is also a Soviet Jewish immigrant herself. After Golodryga interviews Vindman today, we'll have some time for audience questions. Those of you with us in person should please write your questions on the note cards you received when you walked in, and my colleagues Sydney and Daniel will walk down the aisles and collect them from you in just a few minutes. Those of you with us online can share your questions in the live stream chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Alexander Vindman and Biana Golodryga for a conversation about Here Right Matters, An American Story.
Thank you so much for coming. Alex and I go way back, but this is the first time we've actually met. So it was a nice reunion of sorts. We got to know each other, obviously. I was introduced to him, as all of you were, and the world was, during his incredibly brave testimony during President Trump's first impeachment hearing. And a little background about me and what drew us together is that I and my family, we came as political refugees from the former Soviet Union, from Moldova in 1980. So as soon as we heard Alex's story and his background, everyone reached out to me, of course. I called my parents, and this was a personal story and a personal connection prior to even meeting. I reached out to his brother, who's sitting right here via Facebook as a investigative journalist that I am. And we made the connection finally with Alex, and it's been kind of a crazy ride for you the past year and a half. But I think I'm going to begin by asking what I've asked you before, maybe as you introduce yourself to a new audience. Was it all worth it? Was everything that you experienced, the highs, the many lows, mostly initially at the beginning, was it all worth it to get you to this point where you are here speaking before this audience?
Well, first, thanks for moderating this discussion, and the museum for hosting us, my older brother Len for coming out here, attending my first, I've done a bunch of these, but he hasn't been able to make it, so that's cool. Yes, but I won't leave it there.
Okay, you can.
Yeah. The reason I say yes is that I was able to, in doing my duty, I was able to protect and defend U.S. national security, defend the Constitution of the United States. That, to me, seems like a small price to pay for just starting over, as my family has done on so many occasions. If I had not said anything, there's a very high likely scenario in which Donald Trump would have been president for a second term. And this is not like a pie in the sky idea. What most people don't realize is that Donald Trump was 2 days away from realizing his corrupt enterprise. There was an interview scheduled with one of your colleagues, actually, scheduled for September 13th, in which Zelensky was supposed to deliver this investigation, and he didn't. And the reason he didn't is because I initiated a sequence of events in reporting a presidential abuse of power that resulted in 3 congressional committees conducting an investigation, and that resulted not only did it lift the freeze on Ukrainian security assistance, but it also prevented Zelensky from delivering on this investigation. Now, I don't cast a negative light on President Zelensky. His country is in a state of war against Russia. It's pretty amazing that he held out for months and at the risk of hundreds of millions of dollars of aid and U.S. support, and in those waning days where it looked like he had no choice but to do what was squarely in his country's interest, he was going to announce this investigation. Now, if that happened, where would we have ended up? We would have ended up with then Vice President Joe Biden, tainted going into primaries, and potentially not making it through primary season, and President Trump running against arguably a lesser candidate, and we would have been in a position where Donald Trump would have been a 2-term president. And as bad as Donald Trump was in his first term, there was the break of wanting to get reelected, at least, that prevented even more corruption and more abuse. And just in doing my duty, not doing anything more than I thought I was obligated to do as an Army officer that had sworn an oath to the Constitution, just in reporting it, I was able to play a role in protecting the country. And I could live with the consequences for that.
You talk about it all in detail in this book, and I encourage everyone to buy a copy if you haven't already. It's a fantastic book, and I read through it, I think, in about a day or two prior to our first interview. You talk about not only your actions and the subsequent conversation that you had with your twin brother, because you have several brothers, and I asked you this in the interview, but I think it bears repeating because I think that's an interesting concept of whether or not you would have come forward had your twin brother not been a legal aid there working with you, to whom you first approached after hearing that phone call.
It was, first of all, it's pretty awesome having my twin brother in the White House. We were the National Security Council twins, probably the first and the last set of twins to serve on there. I think the lesson's been learned. But it was fantastic. He was there. He joined about a week after me, and in addition to just having somebody to bounce ideas off of, he had all the security clearances, or almost all the security clearances I had a need to know. He had a kind of an oversight role with regards to the ethics portfolio. So he was just somebody I talked to on a regular basis. In the context of this particular report, people sometimes focus on this July 25th phone call, but this was the second time I was reporting a corrupt scheme. The first time was reporting other Trump political appointees, a gentleman named Gordon Sondland, proposing an investigation into Joe Biden on July 10th, and claiming that he received his marching orders from Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff. And I reported that to Eugene's, my twin brother's superior, the senior legal counsel, a guy named John Eisenberg. It's kind of amazing how many Jewish folks are on the National Security Council. But I reported to John Eisenberg, and that was where I was going to take my report. This time, I probably could have avoided maybe a little bit of pain and suffering for Eugene if I didn't go to him first and didn't drag him in as a witness to my report. There's this kind of famous scene in the book in which I walk into his office and close the door and say, Eugene, if what I'm about to tell you ever becomes public, the president would be impeached, will be impeached. I made that comment based on the gravity of the moment and recognizing exactly what it was the president was doing. He was violating the law, something called the Impoundment Act, the necessity to spend congressionally appropriated and directed funds in a particular way, the corruption of free and fair elections, the actions in opposition to what had been U.S. national security, which was strong support for Ukraine, because Ukraine's an important partner, and Ukraine is a bulwark against Russian aggression. All these different things, and I recognized what was going on. The call was, in a way, was just one last missing piece in the puzzle. Everything else is pretty clear. The only question was whether Donald Trump was involved, and as a result of the phone call, it was abundantly clear. I couldn't let the blinders of a reverence for the office of the president blind me. As a military officer, there is that kind of reverence for the office of the president, and it became abundantly clear that the president was involved and was the driving force. And I didn't, recognizing that the U.S. is different and nobody's above the law, I reported the president's wrongdoing like I would have anybody else's.
Which leads us to the famous line which you delivered in your opening testimony. We've gotten to know your brothers here and your brother Eugene, and with this opening line, I'd like you to lead us more into your family history and your backstory and your immigrant story as well. But I'll repeat it for those just as a reminder of why it stood out the way it did. You said, "Dad, I'm sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected professionals. Is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union. Do not worry. I will be fine for telling the truth." You went on to say, "Here right matters." And that led to a number of stories delving into your background, why you singled out your father and his story in bringing you and your family to this country from Ukraine in 1979 at the age of 4. So can you tell us about your life back in Ukraine from what you can remember and your father's plight?
Sure. So first, I'm not sure, you were reading, so you didn't notice the cringe when you read that line, because I should have listened to Rachel, my wife. She said, read the statement a few more times, make sure you have it down. And for some reason, I kept stumbling over the words elected officials. I don't know what an elected professional is, but that's what I kept saying in the testimony.
Not all of them act professionally, but
I know,
they are.
That's true.
You know.
I try to correct myself. I knew I got it wrong. I tried it like 3 times, and it always came out as elected professionals.
Well, that's not what stood out in that line, as you know.
But anyway, so it's like it's reliving my failing to listen to my wife.
It's not my intent.
Yeah. No, but I think this was not prepared. It was all kind of extemporaneous, and the line "Here right matters" was a description and encapsulation of the fact that I believe, continue to believe in American exceptionalism, that this country is different. It's a refuge for refugees. It's a place of opportunity. It's a place that, in spite of its being a work in progress and an unrealized project of a more perfect union, makes progress towards that more perfect union. It was in stark contrast to my own family's experience fleeing from the Soviet Union, like your family, where opportunities were limited, not just because it was a communist regime and the elites basically accrued power and benefits for themselves. Notorious, the divides in this supposedly egalitarian society, but also for the Jewish population, where there was anti-Semitism was always a factor. It resulted in some of your distant relatives, some of my distant relatives leaving after pogroms as a result of anti-Semitism rampant throughout the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. But also an increasing kind of anti-Semitism that was surely going to limit our generation's options. My father understood that acutely. He was able to break through in certain ways and rise, but the quota systems in place to limit the progress of the Jewish population were notorious and increasing, and he was responding to that as one of the key drivers of his desire to take us to the U.S. And of course, there was a very deep personal issue with the fact that my biological mother was dying of cancer, and he knew that there was an opportunity to seek better health care here. He had read an article about the Shah of Iran seeking treatment here, and that was his kind of the nexus or the seed of the idea to come. So all of these different reasons, and as I reflected on this title, Here Right Matters, it was about this nation. It was also about the importance of that moment. Constitutional crisis, that's what an impeachment is, and a right mattering in a constitutional crisis where it was my obligation to live up to my oath, but also the elected officials, not professionals, elected officials, and then to me on a very deep personal level that my values and ethics were kind of under siege in doing the right thing, being kind of branded a traitor, unpatriotic, spy, all these other character assassination efforts to cast a shadow over my testimony.
Yeah, and that wasn't just on Twitter. I mean, that was underscored, during cross-examination, even during testimony.
Well, that's true, but some people, I think few people recognize that this was emanating from the White House.
Yeah.
The White House typed up a list of talking points that they sent out to the right-wing media, the OANNs, the Fox Newses, but it was the Trump White House, so not notoriously unreliable. They also sent out those talking points to other independent media, and then so it was clear that these lines of traitor, leaker, all these types of things were just fabrications sent out by the White House to their proxies.
They were classic tropes, though.
Yes.
The image, though, of you talking to your immigrant father was one thing, and obviously it had a huge impact for what America stands for, and we had elected officials on the left in particular really highlight the importance of an immigrant coming to this story, especially given the rhetoric that we heard out of the Trump administration and President Trump directed towards immigrants. But what we would come to find out that you describe in your book was it wasn't just a message to your father in general, right? It was a specific issue and struggle that you had with him as you were deciding about whether or not you would come forward and go through with this. Your father had been urging you not to. And not to speak out against the president and the administration. And I would imagine there were many parents out there, you didn't have to be an immigrant, but especially given his background and our family's backgrounds, that would drive that fear in him.
Right, so a couple of things behind the scenes. My dad would hate to hear this, but there was really no chance of me not doing what I thought was right and testifying. I was going to listen.
But there was a really testy car ride.
There was. there was a testy car ride. There was a couple of testy conversations. The fact was that I recognized that he didn't have all the facts about President Trump's corruption. At the time of that car ride, I think things were still emerging. I think somewhere around there is when President Trump released the transcript of his, implicating himself, always his own worst enemy.
Right.
So this was early days, so my dad didn't fully understand. I couldn't talk to him in detail because he didn't have the need to know the security clearances and all that stuff. So I could just give him outlines of the fact that I'd be drawn into the political fray and surely be called to testify. And he didn't understand, on what basis. And he was responding to this very basic parental instinct, danger, and he understood power too. He lived 47 years in the Soviet Union. He understood how people exercise power, that it could have catastrophic consequences. Everything screamed danger and don't go up against the President of the United States. So that's where he's speaking from. He also was he voted for President Trump in 2016. He tended to vote the way the kind of Russian refugee immigrant bloc votes, which is highly conservative. Anything that smacks of the left, the Democratic Party is not the left.
Explain,
Yeah.
because you really hit on something I was hoping we would get to.
Yeah.
Explain why. I don't want to lump everyone in together, but explain why so many in the immigrant community, especially first generation, and many Russian Jews who may not think too highly of Vladimir Putin, were yet coming around to the defense and support of President Trump, because it's not only, or Republican, it's not only about lower taxes.
Yeah. That's right. I think there is a visceral reaction. There are two different things. One is propaganda, and the other one is kind of like a deeply kind of emotional, not just emotional, but kind of like a PTSD of sorts, a post-traumatic stress of sorts, I'd say. I think that's actually a good way to look at it, where a population is subjected to the tyranny of the left, an authoritarian left, they tend to react viscerally and swing in an unhealthy manner towards the right. You see this not just in the Soviet immigrant community, but you see it in the Vietnamese community. You see it in the Cuban community. You see it in the Venezuelan community. You see this in a number of
Look at the
different
Hispanic community in Texas. Many of them turned out more than people had expected voting for Trump.
Right. I think that I think there might be a slightly different phenomenon, that the Democrats seem to think that there's a natural gravity of the Hispanic community. But I'm talking about a visceral reaction from a community that experienced a deep trauma, and in responding to that trauma, rejects anything from the left. And the other in our kind of two-party system, the only other home is the right. So there's that. But there's also an effective propaganda campaign that continues to victimize these populations. Again, it's the fact that these former homelands understand the vulnerabilities and proceed to propagandize those communities with a message of, with a message in the common language, the native language, the Russian language, about the fact that a Democratic Party is socialist, Democratic Party is communist, and these things get very, very easy purchase in the community. And it's very, very unfortunate, because these are, at least twice victimized populations, victimized before they're refugees, and then victimized again by propaganda, and listening to what amounts to a comfortable, a comfort food of ingested from the native language, but that slowly introduces themes that the Russians want, which is support for Donald Trump, somebody that's not acting in the U.S. interests. And I think that's a very, very important thing. And it's important. There's a gap that's being filled because we're an English-speaking society, and there's not a huge amount of Russian language programming. And if there were more Russian language programming that had a less of a partisan view, then there would be a consumption of two sides of a story. But right now, that's not the case. I wanted to, that's a very, very important topic, and frankly, something that requires a lot more exploration to understand why the Russian-speaking community, the Soviet refugees, tend to be so supportive of the right and Donald Trump. There are some other interesting ideas about needing a strong leader to guide this nation. That's probably a carryover from Russian and Soviet authoritarianism. But I did want to briefly mention my twin brother was the one that kind of had introduced the thought of writing something to my dad. So he gets, I'm giving him credit for that one. he had the idea, and I put it into words about addressing my dad's concerns about what was about to unfold.
Smart thinking on Eugene's part.
Well, I mean, I don't know if he gets.
You didn't take all the credit, right?
He gets some of the credit, but since he's
Who was
my
born
twin brother-
first? Who's older?
9 minutes older.
There you go.
So as far as I'm concerned, I'm
It's an
his
important 9 minutes.
It is important. I'm his creator.
Yeah.
So
You're his
therefore,
creator.
I created the idea.
He followed you.
Yeah.
I think obviously no religion is a monolith, and everyone has their own personal views. But I think another interesting differential between American Jews, American-born Jews, and Soviet-born Jews, and it's something that still makes me very uncomfortable, is the idea that in the Soviet Union, Judaism was a nationality. And it's something I never quite could grasp as a child, hearing my parents say that, your library, everything from your library card to my birth certificate to, any legal documents, a driver's license, list your nationality as Jewish. And with that came a different, more secular, because there was no real open, religion allowed throughout the country or practiced. And it led to different lifestyles and households' relationship with their religion, with their nationality. And I'm wondering if you can talk about growing up here as a Russian Jew in, Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, and how that impacted your life and your decisions, as a professional.
Yeah, I think my father came over again when he was 47 with little understanding about the traditions of Judaism, but a deep understanding of the fact that he was Jewish, and he wanted to have his children grow up with a keen understanding of the fact that they were Jewish. I think Len being 6.5 years older, he went to yeshiva for a little while. We went to yeshiva for first grade, and then we went off to public schools. But even so, we were tied into a group called the Friends and Refugees of Eastern Europe. It was a Lubavitcher organization closely associated with the synagogue at 770, and we would basically get the equivalent of like Hebrew school, Sunday school lessons several times a month to make sure we developed a deeper understanding of what it means to be, not to just have a Jewish identity, but what it means to be Jewish, and understanding the traditions and the practices. We were bar mitzvahed. I think there was a period of time where we, as we moved through high school and college, we probably drifted a little bit away from Judaism, and I'm happy to say that one of my closest friends in the military, another Jewish man, Jewish officer, West Pointer, my dearest friend from my military time, kind of drew me back into Judaism. So I'd go to the Shabbat services and holiday services with him, and I think as I married and started my family, I also had kind of the same idea that my dad did, except probably I'm trying to do it pretty consistently. Where my daughter, we're members of a Dot Re'im in Northern Virginia, and our daughter goes to Hebrew school Sundays and Wednesdays and stuff like that. So she's learning her prayers. She's gonna be bat mitzvahed when she grows up, and she has a foundation to kind of judge the kind of Jewish practice she wants to be involved in. It's something that's I struggle with this notion of like how faithful I am to the Jewish faith. I think I could take some pride in carrying forward some of the best traditions about ethics and values. I'll take some of that. I remember in the acknowledgments I talk about my rabbi at Dot Re'im, Bruce Aft, that saw me kind of under pressure in some of these key moments, coming up to me and giving me the counsel of, like, if not you, Rabbi Hillel, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And that being kind of really critical as I made some key decisions. I thought about those words. I thought about ethics and values that were deeply tied to Jewish ethics and values, about Army values, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage, all these things. And I tried to use these as a kind of a touchstone to guide my decisions through some some unprecedented challenges.
Yeah, my story was a bit different. My parents were outliers, I would say, and did not want to go to New York or LA, where the majority of Soviet Jews were immigrating to. And so they said they wanted to go somewhere warm, and HIAS, the refugee resettlement organization, which we'll talk about in a minute, which helped move your family and helped move millions of families, resettled us to Galveston, Texas. So I grew up in Houston, where my parents still live, and growing up there without that many Jews, especially in those early years, around you, you're constantly reminded that you're different. But I think it takes developing and knowing more about your background and your heritage and becoming a bat mitzvah and becoming a parent where you have a real grasp and appreciation for the freedoms and the beauty that are in Judaism, especially as an American Jew. But on that note, I'm wondering if you had experiences throughout your career and personally. And unfortunately, I know the answer to this, over the last 2 years, but with anti-Semitism throughout your life here, because obviously it's one of the reasons our families moved here, and this is the best country in the world. But as we said, there are some ugly parts too.
I absolutely don't miss the fact that white nationalism is on the rise in the U.S. As a symptom of kind of deeper grievances with racial inequality, racial injustice, economic inequality, and unfortunately, in much the same way it emanated in other societies in the 20th century. I, in a lot of ways, have been pretty fortunate. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Borough Park, where there was a large Jewish population. I didn't necessarily look like those other kids because a lot of them were Hasidic and we were more secular. But I didn't, and there, frankly, at times there were taunts from those kids. But I didn't really experience deep anti-Semitism. In the military, it's pretty egalitarian. It's not anti-Semitism as much as kind of favoritism for kind of white Protestant officers that had more in common with some of the senior leadership, but not anything that I would describe as anti-Semitism. Several times I did encounter it were like as a result of ignorance. Mm-hmm. Some young soldier from the South that never had any interaction with a Jewish person, kind of hearing and repeating a trope about like, don't let them Jew you down or something like that. And fortunately, I was in a position as an officer to make those corrections and to let them know that that kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. I've always been if I see something, I say something. I kind of stand up. Try to live with few regrets about letting something wrong slide by. But I also want to acknowledge that that's not necessarily that's not necessarily a lot of other people's experience. I think there is a kind of anti-Semitism from both the right and the left. Mm-hmm. From the right, it's definitely has to do with kind of what we more traditionally identify as white nationalism.
White nationalism, yeah.
And on the left, there is also a tendency to paint Jews with the brush of perceived
loyalty
to Israel. Or some sort of claims of apartheid in Israel, and basically put that on the Jewish population here as if they're not American Jews with supreme loyalty to America, but as Israelis or something of that nature. And this is very problematic. It kind of emerges as this boycott, divest, and sanction movement, which is against Israel, but then expands towards the Jewish population at large. So those are things that I think the Jewish population has to face here. But we also are blessed with being recognized as part of American culture, the Judeo-Christian culture, where the Jewish population is, except for these relatively fringe movements, on the right, it's frankly on ascent and something that worries me, but we're generally accepted as part of the American Judeo-Christian identity, where we enjoy, wide acceptance. Even the dominant culture here of white Protestants and evangelicals are very supportive of the Jewish state and Judaism. But it's something to maintain vigilance about because there have been a number of really difficult attacks. I think I heard that today was the 3rd anniversary of the Tree of Life.
Today is the 3rd anniversary to the day.
Massacre. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to note that it's 3 years since that shooting, and the American Jewish Committee just released this stunning statistic that 1 in 4 U.S. Jews has been targeted with anti-Semitism in the last year, and 4 out of 10 have taken steps to conceal their Jewishness. And as we've seen a rise in hate crimes against people of color and the Asian community and the Black community, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism as well. And just using your national security pedigree and expertise, how big of a threat is that, do you think, longer term?
Fundamentally, it is probably what could. It's maybe the thing that ends the American experiment. There's always been this thought about strength through unity, e pluribus unum. Together, we're a formidable force, the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful nation in history. We still maintain that place, even as other countries in the international system rise. But it's the internal weaknesses that are by far the bigger threat. It's not that Russia is going to Russia and/or China. I'm happy to talk about why Russia comes up first. Why that they'll be the end of America through some sort of external existential crisis. It's internally. It's that this country fractures along kind of cultural, ethnic, ideological lines. So to me, this is probably the biggest thing that our leaders, the Biden administration, need to address, and an area where I frankly think that they're falling short. There's a rhetoric around unity that's critical, but the notion needs to be operationalized. How do you achieve that unity? It's not just that people are going to come together. It's not just because that there's ultimately a transition from Trump to Biden, from Republican to administration to Democratic administration. That's not sufficient. We have open wounds. We have hyperpolarization. There needs to be a scheme developed, a plan developed to figure out how to treat those wounds and start to bring this country together. Because I think that we're headed in a direction of increased polarization, which is hard to imagine because we're pretty polarized. But increased polarization, a kind of dehumanization of the other side, and potential hostility.
Yeah, I mean, the threat from within is something that you picked up on, and your boss at the time, Fiona Hill, picked up on, and it really stood out to me that both of you wrote books and memoirs and have given speeches and interviews highlighting the threat not from what you're trained to focus on, which is from the former Soviet Union, Russia, and what have you. It's that it seemed both from what you have said and witnessed following your testimony to leading up to the January 6th insurrection, to what Fiona Hill noted during her testimony during the impeachment and subsequently, thank you, that it was what you both saw happening within the country that alarmed you more than what you were trained to focus on as the biggest threat to this country.
That's right, but I think that's because we're trained.
And you're both immigrants.
Right, I think that's part of it. We're both national security analysts, and analysts being probably the key component there. And we both recognize American power, the immensity of American power. And again, the threats are internal primarily. There are plenty of external threats that matter. Russia is a critical external threat, but the internal threats are what could undo this American experiment.
Yeah, and I do think I want to highlight again that both you and Fiona and Dr. Hill, your perspectives as immigrants is something that is reflected in many immigrant households, and it's what I heard constantly from my parents growing up, is that people who chose to come here appreciate what they came for in a way more than people who were born into it, because that's all they know. So the fight to maintain it is even stronger.
That's right. I think I like to think of it as perspective.
Yeah.
We have the perspective of being immersed in our family stories about the hardship from where we came from. Our parents have the perspective of living in two different systems and seeing how America is exceptional. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Americans don't have that perspective. They think that their creature comforts, or the lack of creature comforts, are meaningful when our families faced kind of struggles of survival. And I think there's a complacency around that, but there's also an apathy. Two different things. Complacency thing is that things will be okay. Country's fine. Apathy is that can't do anything about it. Why bother? Why not show up? These are two different issues that I think we're dealing with, and part of the reason that I've probably become a little bit more, I've definitely become more active in trying to get people to turn out to vote, is because we need to shake off complacency and apathy. American citizens have not just a privilege, but a duty to vote and exercise their voice.
Yeah, I dare you to find many immigrants who are not the most patriotic people you'll meet, right? I'm speaking from my parents, and I'm sure from your family as well. Final two questions before I turn to the audience questions. You talk about your father and that warning to him, the message to him actually against his warning that here right matters, that you'll be fine for telling the truth. I mean, you're not sitting behind bars. You're not, Navalny in Russia, but you didn't get promoted, right, for certain jobs. I mean, you were in a way punished, I would imagine, in areas that you didn't even expect. How did that make you feel at the time?
Well, it wasn't a particularly simplistic notion that I'll be fine. I knew I would be fine in the sense that I wouldn't end up like a political prisoner, or I wouldn't be, put in front of a firing squad. I had every confidence in that. I also had the confidence in the fact that even if I needed to start over, which is, those are like a couple of themes in the book. Don't self-deter, start over. I had the tools to potentially land on my feet. So it wasn't a really simplistic notion that I wouldn't suffer any consequences. I knew the Trump administration was notoriously vindictive. I knew I was going to lose my treasured position at the White House, something that I'd worked long and hard to attain, that there was going to be some sort of impact. I didn't necessarily recognize, in terms of surprises, I didn't recognize that my military career was going to be done. I thought there was a risk of that, but I also had confidence in the fact that my military leadership would how should I say this? They would take the military values that they instill in the force, in the military, and live those military values. So that was a little bit surprising. But it was probably an impossible situation where they had to make a decision between one person that represented the institution and the institution itself. The problem is that I think their calculations were a little off in that in failing to protect somebody that was living up to the Army values, they undermined the institution also.
Yeah, their silence was pretty deafening and spoke volumes. Final question. The last time you and I spoke over the summer in an interview, I asked you if you thought that if former President Trump would run and seek election again, and you said no. And I'm wondering if you still stand by that.
I just don't see a path, at least not a path to victory. So maybe...
he's held his party pretty much hostage.
So I guess the thing is, he potentially has a path to win the nomination, but I don't see how he wins 2024. Maybe that was the clarification as I thought about it, because he lost by 7 million votes in 2020, and he's only further subdivided his electorate, his base. He's lost millions of voters in driving an insurrection on January 6th. He's lost, so he's taken his smaller sliver of the pie and further divided it. So I don't see how he could possibly win, and with no chance of winning, I guess the question is, does he run? But I think the bigger issues probably have to do with Trumpism and
the fact that 60% of Republican voters, if you believe the polls, still think the election was stolen from him.
Yeah.
But let's get to audience questions here. The first one is, how has your life changed since becoming a public figure?
Well, I speak publicly, which is not something I did in the past. I had my kind of my circle of professionals, policy experts, diplomats, and so forth, and I would exchange ideas with them, and now I exchange ideas with kind of the society at large. I find that I could just write a missive. Over the past year, I've written couple dozen, maybe not a couple dozen, but easily a dozen, probably more pieces that have infected like a virus the policy community and driven some conversations. That's kind of a unique position to be in. I could endorse a political candidate and generate some attention. I did so for Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic nominee for governor of Virginia, recognizing that, in fact, that's a bellwether for elections going to 22 and 2024, and trying to make sure that a Trump endorsed candidate doesn't win Virginia, so I could have some sort of political impact. So that's, I guess politics.
You're a prolific tweeter too.
Yeah, politics, not as much as my wife.
Yes.
National security, I'm on the board of the Renewed Democracy Initiative, trying to come up with solutions to vexing issues facing the United States. I try to stay active on those kind of three things I put out as markers for myself: continue public service, advocate for public servants, advance national security interests, and accountability, holding political officials that have fallen short of their obligations to account.
I'm glad you mentioned your wife, Rachel Vindman. If you don't follow her, you should. She is a tour de force, and she's just been fantastic on social media and in interviews and in her platforms as well. The next question: do you think that you will resume your military career now that President Biden is in office?
On the topic of Rachel, she's actually the newest contributor and weekly columnist for USA Today. I think her piece is coming out in the next couple of days. No, I don't think so. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I'm working on a doctorate at Johns Hopkins. I'm researching U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine. It's probably going to be pretty impactful when it's done. So I'm laser focused on that. I still have this this book tour, although I'm trying to wrap that up. There are a lot of other things that I want to do where I'm accountable to myself and my own interests, and not necessarily beholden to somebody else. I'm really enjoying that, not being in a hierarchy and responsible to somebody else, except for my wife.
Good answer.
Yeah. So I think, and it would be impossible for the Army to welcome me back in, especially since I was critical of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently, based on a number of missteps. And I think also, frankly, indicative of the Biden administration, they're pretty risk averse. They don't want the headaches of bringing Alex Vindman into the Army or any other governmental position. They don't need those headaches.
Yeah, what's the likelihood you'd even be confirmed if the position required confirmation?
Been pretty hard on Ted Cruz.
Yes.
So.
Who isn't? How would you define patriot?
It's a good question. I think there's a fundamental love of country and a kind of country before party, country before self. I think that folks that serve in the military are patriots because they're prepared to put the country's interest above their own. I think a patriot is not necessarily somebody that's willing to adhere to an individual or kind of a base ideology, but to kind of a higher notion. Every school child pledges allegiance to the flag when they're in school, but that flag is kind of an emblem for the country, for the Constitution. It's not about a party. It's not about a dogma or a demagogue. And I think it's in some ways it's easier to describe what patriotism isn't at the moment than what it is.
This is interesting. You and I have talked about this. Do you identify as Russian, Ukrainian, Soviet, or none of the above?
I think at one point I identified as any one of those things, but I could tell you where I am now and the evolution here. So I think we all kind of identified as Soviet refugees. The Soviet Union did a pretty good job of instilling kind of that kind of identity into the population. At one point I identified as Russian because as part of the propaganda, the Russians assured us that they were benevolent to the Jewish population, and it was the Moldovans and the Ukrainians that were...
Yeah, who was a bigger anti-Semite?
Yeah, who was a bigger
anti-Semite?
Who's bigger, who conducted the bigger pogroms.
Right.
The Russians were absolutely no better than the Ukrainians or the Moldovans. Now, frankly, I embrace the fact I'm an American of Ukrainian origin. You could sense that I didn't say Ukrainian American because I put American first. That's just the way I grew up here from a young age, but of Ukrainian origin, because there's something, as I studied more and more about Ukraine's history, Judaism thrived in Ukraine for very, very long spells. And there were bigger issues than kind of some sort of Ukrainian nationalism or anti-Semitism in play. So it's not just as simple as saying that, that the Ukrainians were worse than some other population to the Jews. So yeah, Russian, all of them at one point or another are now American of Ukrainian origin.
Yeah, I say Soviet still, I mean, American and Soviet Jew, if for no other reason than I think a lot of people didn't know what Moldova was.
It's easier.
And, but, Golodriga is a Ukrainian name. Apparently that's, my great-great-great-grandfather was a rabbi there, so we have that connection too.
He's probably friends with my great-great-grandfather.
Yeah, the Golodrigas and Vindmans.
Also
yeah, it was
a
a fun
rabbi.
play date, yeah. Do you still feel that right matters in the U.S.? Have your feelings changed since you testified in front of Congress?
I do. I think that right matters for most Americans. For the vast majority of Americans, right matters. I felt that viscerally with the kind of support I received from the American public. I was fortunate to kind of feel the warm embrace of my fellow Americans. In spite of what the media focused on, which is the negativity and the social media attacks and some of the public commentary from talking heads and political proxies. But I felt support from Americans. I think while it does matter to most Americans, there is still this very disturbing issue of complacency and apathy. So when I talk about right mattering in America, I also encourage people to recognize that if we want right to matter, we need to make it matter. That means participation in the community. That means people exercising their right to vote. It matters now, but it may not matter in the future. So make it matter.
And final question. Do you think Putin is more of a threat to the U.S. security and democracy under Biden than he was under Trump?
Absolutely not. There was nobody that was bigger a threat. Trump was the biggest threat to U.S. national security because he looked out for his own self-interest and not America's interests. And in a lot of ways, he achieved Putin's objectives without Putin having to really do that much. Putin's objectives are to weaken the United States, to kind of fracture the U.S. from within, to exploit fissures, ethnic, economic, whatever the case might be. Trump did that. Trump did that on his own accord because he thought that was a way to, drive out the base to vote for him. Biden is under President Biden, policy is a little bit different. It's not whether President Biden puts U.S. national security first. He does. Trump didn't. It's whether he's going to be sufficiently muscular in responding to Russian aggression. And I think that's the question. I think I have a concern about the fact that Russia has been able to act with impunity, increasingly more aggressive, without being held to account. And the Biden administration should reestablish deterrence. These are the red lines. If you attack us in the cyber domain, there'll be consequences. Using economic coercion, whatever the case might be, there'll be costs to Russian malign influence. And that's the Biden administration should move in that direction. There are some inherent risks with that because the Russians are used to getting away with stuff, and if you start to hold them to account, they'll be puzzled, perplexed, and try to push and test. But that's the only way we really secure the U.S. in the long term. Otherwise, the Russians will continue to attack U.S. interests until they hit a really firm red line, something really critical, and then there's a chance. That's where the chance for escalation becomes high. But yes, I know that the Biden administration has a lot of experts that are focused on Russia. They're trying to figure out if they get out of the Russia business because they want to pivot to Asia. I don't think they'll be successful.
How is Putin interpreting that? Because Biden's been very vocal on Russia basically being, a nuisance and China being the big threat. Right.
It's a problem because Putin will not be put in a position where there's a keen sense of Russian exceptionalism. Russia is a superpower in its own conception. It will not be relegated to the dustbin of history. It has the security and defense apparatus to continue to make trouble, to be a spoiler, to escalate tensions in Ukraine. And I don't think it's going to be that easy to just kind of shift our attention somewhere else and keep Russia on simmer.
We know Putin hated when Obama called Russia a regional power, right? Not a global one. Alex, this could go on for hours, but I know you've got lots of fans that people want to sign, have you sign their books, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. Thank you guys so much for coming today. Thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. You're a wonderful neighbor to have. Thank you.
Bianna, Alex, thank you so much for this fascinating and very insightful conversation. You can purchase Here Right Matters, an American Story, in our lobby in just a few minutes and get it signed by the author. Those of you joining us online can order the book at the link in the live stream chat. We're particularly grateful to all of you joining us in person and online who are members and supporters of the museum. Everything we do is made possible through donor support, so thank you. I also want to note that we have a new exhibition on our third floor just opened last week, featuring the work of another Soviet Jewish immigrant, Boris Lurie, a Holocaust survivor and artist. So if you have time before the museum closes, check out that exhibition on the third floor. Those of you online, come visit us in person and see it for yourselves. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again. Take care.